Started. Thanks again for coming to the Department of Education Reform's lecture series. We're very open to hearing suggestions from you about people we ought to be inviting in the future, so please do pass along those suggestions. And today we're very pleased to have with us David Figlio, who is the Knight Ridder Professor of Economics at the University of Florida. He is also editor of the journal Education, Finance, and Policy. And we're pleased to have him here despite weather difficulties and plane delays. And also, we understand that David has been to 49 states except Oklahoma. And this morning we were tempted to dash to Siloam Springs and make it 50, but with weather and time running short, we decided not to do that. So we'll simply have to have David back again, so we look forward to this being one of the David Figlio series of lectures as part of the Department of Education Reform series. So please, David Figlio. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for having me here. I think that I have to say that I really pride myself on knowing geography, and but it only dawned on me just last night just how close I was to fulfilling a lifelong dream. Already, you know, if the level of intellectual discourse weren't sufficient to want me to have me wanting to come back over and over again, certainly the temptation of Oklahoma definitely has me there. So yes, I'll look forward to this being the first of multiple trips over the years. Today I'm going to talk about something in relatively short supply in Arkansas right now, that is heat. And instead going to talk a little bit about a important school reform in Florida that many people in the room have no doubt heard about before, but we're providing a new set of evidence on this particular thing. The state of Florida, as you probably know, with the election of Jeb Bush in 1998, introduced a major change in education policy in which all schools were given a letter grade from A through F. And schools that got high grades besides getting praise, also got additional resources, bonuses. Schools that got low grades were sanctioned, and schools that persistently got grades of F, that is 2 years in a 4-year rolling window, the students who were slated to attend that school or were attending that school last year ended up becoming eligible for school vouchers, known as opportunity scholarships. So what this accountability system really does is very interesting. I mean, there's no doubt that it dramatically incentivized the entire system of public education in Florida. And what this accountability system provides is a really interesting opportunity to study all sorts of different forms of competitive pressure and accountability pressure. And so this is this paper is one of a series of papers mainly written with my co-author C.C. Rouse at Princeton University, but occasionally with Dan Goldhaber at University of Washington and Jane Hanaway at the Urban Institute. Today's talk is about low-performing schools and their responses. Now, looking at the test score responses of low-performing schools to accountability and voucher pressure is not a new subject. Several people in this room have been interested in that question before, in and outside of Florida. I think the biggest thing was that we're going to add some bells and whistles to that question as well. But I think the biggest thing that we're really trying to add here in this paper is getting inside the black box. It's all well and good for people like me or like Jay or others to say, okay, well, it's clear that there are these positive test score effects as a consequence of being pressured under this program. But what Jay and I and others in the past haven't been able to say is what's actually going on that's generating those. And I'm not going to claim that I have all the answers. After all, I mean, people have been trying to think about policy responses or test score effects of policy responses in all sorts of ways for decades. But what we're going to try to do here is really focus on this word how. I have to be careful not to touch the board. How low-performing schools are responding to voucher and accountability pressure. So I understand I should talk for about half an hour and then raise the question. I wander back and forth a lot, so you'll be on your toes the whole talk, Jonathan. Okay, so the introduction, in some regards, is actually perhaps could almost be a mission statement for a Department of School Reform. We have, there's widespread general dissatisfaction with school performance in the United States in general, despite decades of funding increases. And this has led to a number of different calls, including calls for performance incentives in education. And there are a number of main views, and we'll focus on two main views of introducing performance incentives into education. We have one which is I would argue is kind of a school autonomy type of approach, and this tends to be governed by market mechanisms, and so this would include things like school vouchers and increased school choice. And then there's the other pillar, which is a notion of trying to align curriculum with performance standards and holding schools accountable for student outcomes. Now, importantly, both of these types of approaches to introduce performance incentives in education are focused on trying to increase the efficiency level of schools as opposed to necessarily the resources with which these will work. Although, actually, in the case of Florida, there were resource increases in addition to increased performance incentives. I'll talk very briefly about some evidence. I'd say that the evidence on market and test-based accountability is mixed right now. It's somewhat difficult to really tie down what the evidence is in large measure because there's all sorts of different settings, for example. But I would argue that there's the nationwide studies tend to show that school accountability boosts test scores modestly. A number of state studies, including a study in Florida that I've conducted, for example, in the past, have shown increases, especially in math. There's modest evidence. I mean, my take on the voucher literature is that there's evidence of modest gains in terms of the competitive effects of vouchers on public schools. Not earth-shattering, but certainly not negative and probably positive in general. But in a number of these cases, I mean, the studies are really limited by a lack of clearly defined control and treatment groups. And so therefore, we have to have these hand-wavy types of slides that say, it looks like there are positive benefits that are not earth-shattering, but nothing's ever earth-shattering in education, but positive benefits associated with accountability and voucher threats. But at the same time, it's hard to know really for sure what's going on. Well, I'm not going to say that we're going to know for sure after today's talk, but at least I want to contribute to that a little bit with some new findings. Regardless of what you think about the test score responses to accountability, there's much less research on behavioral responses to accountability. The most studied response is teaching to the test. I couldn't resist this. This is, now we all know that they do things interestingly in math. This is my daughter's 4th grade math book. And you can see that Harcourt has a Florida edition of math that's especially focused on things like vote counting. In anticipation, I actually decided to copy what her homework was yesterday. And you can see that her homework actually was to get ready for the FCAT. Now actually, beyond that, though, some of these questions are pretty cool. You can't really see it very well. This was actually what she's having to do as part of her math book. Now, some people. Oh, that's right. So there have been a lot of studies of teaching to the test in many different settings. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think a lot of people who are in favor of standards would argue that's exactly what we want to do, right? We want to set high standards. We want to align tests with rigorous tests to those standards, etc. And so teaching to the test is actually desired. I'll be agnostic on that. There's other type of research, for example, differential reclassification of low-achieving students as disabled as a potential response to accountability pressures. No Child Left Behind throws a little bit of a monkey wrench in that incentive. There's evidence that in certain circumstances we may see selective discipline apparently aimed at reshaping the testing pool. There's one of my favorite is feeding to the test, in which schools juice the school meals in order to try to give kids a glucose boost right before the test, and it actually turns out to work. We have evidence of rearrangement of students within a school district, and of course outright teacher cheating. So there's lots and lots and lots of these really negative things. I mean, people look at this and they say, oh, this is this list of all these terrible things that schools might be trying to do, so that really none of those findings anybody ever finds are really genuine. It's all this gaming. I would argue that that's jumping the gun, and in fact there's been very little in the way of a systematic effort to determine substantive responses to voucher and accountability pressure, and that's really what this project is all about. Of course, I just talked about all these things like juicing lunches and rigging suspensions, but to the extent to which those things happen, of course, it's hard for schools to keep that up over and over and over again for years and years and years. I mean, the fact that we see that, actually, in my opinion, says that schools are intensely aware of incentives, and school officials and teachers are trying hard to try to figure out the best ways to look good in the system. Well, now, one of the ways in which schools may try to look good is to actually be good, and so one of the things that we see here, that we're trying to do here, is to look at substantive school policies and practices that potentially influence performance. And actually, in my opinion, and we're actually going to tie this back to performance, at least to some degree, in my opinion, that's actually even less important than the fact that they're changing substantive policies and practices. Because we're so fixated, people are so fixated, the narrative is really about all these manipulations schools are doing. And they're clearly doing them. But there's much less narrative about the positive manipulations as well. It's an important question for several reasons. First of all, if we observe test score gains, but not changes in policies and practices, then that could lead us to suspect the gains may not be genuine. They could just be the crazy science that people are doing. Most students are likely to remain in public education regardless of what arrangements are designed to provide the K-12 education, and so of course it's important to know what the public schools are doing. And so, of course, the primary reason that we haven't had this lack of research is not that I'm the first person to think this is an important topic, but rather because there's lack of data on the subject. So, what we're going to try to do, we're going to remedy this data shortcoming with an extraordinarily rich original survey data set that has covered the universe of public schools in Florida, which we've matched with detailed administrative data on students. Now, in some regards, this is very much like the world's longest pregnancy, because my colleagues and I have been collecting these data, it seems like it has been for years. I realized that from the time in which we started collecting this data to the time in which we wrote the first paper based on these data, there were, amongst this research team, there were 3 divorces, 2 marriages, and 2 babies born. And so it's quite, I'm quite happy to be taking the show on the road. We're going to utilize quasi-experimental methods to identify the effects of accountability on both performance as well as on behaviors. And to do that, we're going to exploit a change in accountability regimes that happened in 2002 that affected some schools differently from others. Now, we're not the first to look at this change in accountability regimes. Paul Peterson and Marty West also studied a corner of the same policy change in a recent paper that they wrote as well. Fortunately, I'm happy to report that the areas in which our research and theirs overlap, the results also overlap. That's always reassuring. So we're going to be looking at the same basic type of policy change, but then bringing it to a larger set of outcomes. So we're going to estimate the effects of accountability on, I could try out the cool thing. Estimate the effects of accountability on both short run as well as longer term student outcomes. The short run is actually very, it's a little bit different than what Paul and Marty were doing, but it's a similar general idea. Longer term is something new there. We're studying the specific behavioral responses found on our surveys to accountability pressure, and we're going to try to attempt to determine the degree to which these measured policy and practice changes explain the changes in test scores that we observe. So that's our empirical approach. So let me tell you a little bit about school accountability in Florida. I already really mentioned some of this. A+ plan, which was Jeb Bush's first legislative initiative, introduced a series of rewards and sanctions. There was curriculum-based testing in grades 3 through 10. Curriculum-based testing occurred prior to the A+ plan, but it was expanded to include all of the intermediate grades. Schools got letter grades from A through F. A schools and improving schools got financial rewards. D schools and F schools got technical assistance. We all know what technical assistance means. It's a double-edged sword. There were, in addition to additional financial resources from the state DOE, there was also dramatically increased reporting requirements and site visits, especially for F schools, and repeated F schools, the students became eligible for school vouchers, and as I mentioned before. So there's lots of action happening in Florida. Now, you may wonder, okay, why might incentives improve school efficiency? I get the sense I'm in a friendly audience for talking about this, but I'm a slave to my slides. Economic theory says educators should have an incentive to improve performance, but there are some reasons to believe that they might not. Of course, the theoretical arguments are pretty clear. What are some factors that might motivate F schools? Well, in addition to the voucher effect, there also could be this desire to escape onerous reporting requirements and oversight. There could be a fear of loss of job. There could be this loss of what psychologists would call identity utility or social stigma associated with getting these grades of Fs. So there are a lot of reasons that vouchers and accountability might lead schools to want to improve efficiency. System changed in 2002. The old system was based on a set of expectations for levels of student performance and select grades. So what happened is, in order to get a grade of F, for example, you had to be below a particular performance threshold on average in reading and writing and mathematics. If a school had a higher fraction proficient in any of those three, they avoided a grade of F. In the new system, schools were graded on a grade point system that incorporates all these tested grades. So they increased the set of grades, for one thing. There was a focus on both proficiency levels, like in the old system, as well as student test score gains, especially student test score gains of students who weren't below proficient, and even more attention paid to the bottom readers in the school. Since this time, they added in the bottom math performers, and now they've added in science as well. But the 2002 grade change that we're talking about is focused mainly on this fundamental change. Now, what did this do? Well, what we see here is, well, very few schools ever got Fs, but you can see we went to 4 schools getting Fs in 2000, 0 schools getting Fs in 2001, then there was a blip up in Fs again in 2002, and then by 2003, fewer schools started to get Fs again. One thing you notice is that over time, more and more schools get grades of A. Reasonable people can disagree over the explanation for that. I will say that one rationale for why we saw this dramatic increase in A's from 01 to 02 is because the grading change system, when it moved to this grade point system, actually created a system of safe A's. I have another paper that I'm writing about that, but I'm going to dangle that out as a carrot to you to invite me back so I can go to Oklahoma. One thing you might see here is that these grade points follow a very stable distribution. There's a very stable distribution. It looks pretty normal. And what you can see are these cutoffs. A school has to score 280 to avoid a grade of F, for example. 410 gets you a grade of A, and so on. Okay, there are a lot of different reasons why grades could change from 2001 to 2002. One could be changing demographics, right? Even though demographics could influence both levels as well as test score gains. If a school's changing in demographics, they could move up or move down. We could see actual changes in school performances, policies, or practices. Genuine changes that are happening, and then there could be changes in the grading system. Now, we want to try to identify the effects of changes in the grading system. Why? We don't want to look at, suppose schools are actually improving and that's causing changes in the grade. Well, if that's the case, then if we don't identify off of that, we try to identify off of that, it's hard to know then if we actually find improvement, is it just the schools were on an upward trajectory, for example. So we're trying to identify just the effects of changes in the grading system. So the nice thing about this change in grading system is that you can actually look at schools that received an accountability shock. And so what I did was I ran through the microdata the grade that the school would have gotten had the grading system not changed, versus the grade the school actually ended up receiving because of the change in grading system. And so we could figure out whether the school was upward shocked, downward shocked, or didn't receive a shock. And what you can see here is amongst the schools that would have gotten a grade of D, a good number of them were upward shocked as a result of the change in grades. But we also see a good number, 15%, were downward shocked. So today's talk is going to be focusing on the bottom, those schools that got downward shocked, mostly from D to F. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on in today's talk. What do we know about these F schools? F schools tend to be smaller than higher graded schools. They tend to have more black students, more lower income students. They tend to spend a little more per pupil than higher graded schools. A lot of that is due to the fact that they also tend to be more populated with disabled students. F schools and D students, however, are much more similar along a lot of financial and demographic dimensions. So we're going to focus we're going to look at 3 different steps of this talk. Step 1, does accountability boost test scores? We'll look at high stakes as well as low stakes tests. The state of Florida makes research very easy in some regards. One of the ways it makes research very easy is that the accountability is based on this criterion reference test called the FCAT, but then every student in the same grades, 3 through 10, have to take a national norm reference test, the Stanford 10. So we can look at the high stakes test, which every student had to take, and a low stakes test that is important for comparing against national norms, but at the same time doesn't directly affect the school's grade. We're going to focus on the 5th grade cohort in 2002-2003. This is going to be important. Why focus on one cohort? Well, one reason behind this is that we're going to be comparing two different cohorts. The first set of students who hit 5th grade after the school got shocked to the last set of students who hit 5th grade before the school got shocked. Now, why do we want to do that? We want to do that because we're interested in looking long term, not just what happens the first year, but also what's happening as they move into 6th grade, 7th grade. And we wanted to make sure that the comparison cohort was never contaminated by the grade shock. That's one of the main reasons we're doing this. Now, you may wonder, is there something special about the 5th grade? The same large positive effects we find of getting a grade of F are present if you look at 4th graders, if you look at everything together. We tried every way we possibly could to see if we could kill a positive gain to getting a grade of F. And so there was this famous paper by Javier Sala y Martin on growth models called I Just Ran a Million Regressions. We ran a million regressions. In every one of those million regressions, we found that getting a grade of F improved student test scores, no matter how you slice the data. So I feel completely confident that there's absolutely no chance that this is a result of anything we possibly could have done. And that's on tape. I'm happy to say that. Okay, we have, 180,000.
We can edit that out.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Because I literally did run a million regressions. and because we wanted to see, was there any possible chance we could kill that result? And we can't. And we're going to follow these two cohorts into the future. You know, I don't like ever presenting Greek letters in any talk. So instead we'll do some ocular regression first. And so what we'll do here is this basically is the story, right? We're using a model called regression discontinuity. For those of you who are unfamiliar with regression discontinuity models, the idea here is that there should be some general pattern between some underlying variable and the outcome that we really care about, and it should be smooth. But then, what happens if people on one side of some type of threshold are very differentially affected by a policy vis-a-vis others? Well, this is what happened. This vertical line here is the 280 points. That was the threshold for getting a grade of F. And what we see here is each of these is a different school. These are average residual test scores after we've partialed out everything we could possibly partial out. And what do you see here? You see that generally these grade points, it seems like they follow a pretty flat profile, going up from 280 up. I mean, there's some schools that do well, some schools that do poorly. I don't know who that school is. But in general, it seems pretty flat. But then look to the left, and you see that there's almost no schools that got grades of Fs that had a residual that was anything like these. Instead, they're all dramatically above this. Now, we estimated quintics on both sides. You could do quartics or cubics or sextics, or I don't even know what it is. We tried again, a million different specifications. We find always this jump. And this jump here is basically the story. And again, you can't make that go away. What's the magnitude of that jump? It's about 1/10 of a standard deviation. 1/10 of a standard deviation for people who are in any field besides education is enough to yawn. But in education, if you find anything that affects a student test scores by 1/10 of a standard deviation, that's big news. Just in case you want to look at a different subject, there's reading. Looks pretty similar. I could show you these pictures all day, but I won't do it. But one picture that's important is, you may say, well, maybe there was something special about these kids. Maybe these schools over here, they're just populated by a really special group of kids, and it's somehow special about 280. Well, if you look at the same kids and just back the analysis up a year, when neither group was affected by the policy, find nothing in math, nothing in reading. So this is, I think, the strongest signal. I mean, that's basically visually what our paper shows, at least on the test scores. We could show you these things. If you want standard errors, you see they're all statistically significant. Criterion reference, whoops. Right. Criterion reference tests are always larger than norm reference tests, but importantly, even if you look at norm reference tests, these are the low stakes tests that counted not at all, and still 2/3, 3/4 of a standard deviation, two-thirds of a tenth of a standard deviation, 0.07 to 0.08 of a standard deviation. Those are nice size, and again, these are for standard error Nazis. These are clustered standard errors, so we've done everything right. Suppose you want to look at the first time versus repeat F. What do we see? You see that the first time F schools, we see big positives as well. Then this is the additional effect of getting repeat F. So what we see here is this repeat F could be seen potentially as a Voucher effect, potentially as an additional stigma accountability effect. I don't want to be complete. I don't feel like I can really pin down necessarily how much of this is due to the Voucher threat, because the repeat Fs were voucherized. I don't know how much of this is due to vouchers and how much of this is due to additional onerous requirements, probably somewhere in the middle. But what we see here is, positive but insignificant for reading, but large positive for math. So again, this is some evidence, again, that it seems like there was some positive effects of, additional positive effects of being voucherized. But whether you call it vouchers or accountability, getting this grade of F and repeating as an F is really leading to substantial improvements. We did some cross-cohort comparisons. Again, the results, everything's going to look the same. I'm looking at the clock, and I have 2 more parts to this. So I'll keep on going. 2 years later, look at that. 2 years later, now they're in 7th grade. And we see that even by 7th grade, even in 7th grade, these same kids who were treated with a school that was voucher and accountability threatened in 5th grade, we still see these positive test score improvements 2 more years out. And in some regards, I mean, this is completely new stuff, and it shows that these were genuine changes. This can't possibly be manipulation, right? Because you'd have to have the middle schools in cahoots with the elementary schools too, and I just don't believe that. So I view this as very strong evidence that it's not manipulation. We have problems with inference, including mean reverting measurement error and selection. Okay, so we try some falsification tests. So one possibility is to look at successive cohorts in 4th grade. You see nothing. Why don't we have anything for the criterion reference test in math? It's because the math in 4th grade, we can't back that up. But you can look for norm reference tests in math. You still see nothing. If there was a mean reversion story, we would have expected large negative quote-unquote effects here, but we see nothing, which means it can't possibly be a mean reverting story. You can't. There we go. All right. So how about selection? Maybe what's happening is these schools are getting better because some kids differentially jump ship from F schools. Well, again, we tried, and I talked about this much more in the paper, but I want to keep moving on, so that's why I'm going fast through this. What we see here is there's no evidence of selection, right? I mean, and so I'll just leave it at that to say it can't be that these students are systematically different, because there's just no evidence of it. And we tried this a bunch of different ways. Let me move to step 2. Does accountability affect measured behaviors? So I wish I brought my prop, which was our actual survey. It was a $1 million survey that was funded by NIH, USDOE, as well as Spencer, Annie Casey, Smith Richardson Foundations, and the Atlantic Philanthropic Society. We conducted a survey of all regular public schools in Florida for 3 years, in 99, 2000, 01, 02, and 03, 04. And we did this to try to get kind of before and after effects of this grading change. We received really high response rates. I'm really happy to say we always beat the schools and staffing survey. We got around 2,100 schools responding in 2001-02, and 81% of these continued to respond in 04. So again, we got very high responses, which I think increases the credibility of the findings. We're going to, you could try to deal with all these hundreds of policy variables. We found the best thing to do was to try to use both expert opinion as well as factor analysis to group policy and practice responses into domains. And we do that because of budget constraint problems, right? I mean, you're not going to try everything, but you might try one thing within a given set of policy domains. And so what we're going to do is, the way we do it is actually we estimate accountability effects item by item, and then we identify the average coefficient for accountability in every regression, and then we weight that all up by the standard error of the specific variable. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with that. These are the basic domains: policies to improve low-performing students, lengthening instructional time, reduce class size for specific subjects, narrowing curriculum, scheduling systems. This is a thing like introducing block scheduling or looping, for example. Policies to improve low-performing teachers in various ways, increasing resources available to teachers, incentivizing teachers, increasing or reducing teacher control, changing district control over the schools, changing principal control of school measures of school climate. To give you an idea about inside of this, so let me see if I can find, oh, whoops, no, I didn't do it. I'm sorry. Does anybody bring the paper with them? Thank you. So just as an example, then, just as an example, then, suppose you were interested in thinking about things like policies to improve low-performing students. We asked specifically about things like, do you require grade retention? Do you require summer school? Do you require before or after school tutoring? Do you require in-school supplemental instruction? Do you require additional tutoring? Do you require Saturday classes? For scheduling systems, we looked at, do you introduce block scheduling, common prep periods, subject matter specialist teachers? Do we organize teachers into team? Do you introduce looping, multi-age classrooms, and so on? So, I mean, it was a pretty detailed survey, thank you. A pretty detailed survey, and that just gives kind of just some general examples of what's kind of underlying these domains. Anybody who's interested in a particular variable, just let me know. We report a few of them in an appendix, but we didn't want the paper to be 100 pages long. So what were they doing in 0102? This, actually, I'll skip that because of time, and I'll talk instead about how policies changed between 01 and 02 and 03, 04, given the time. Okay, so what happened to F-graded schools? They were more likely to start requiring grade retention and other forms of supplemental instruction for low-performing students. They were more likely to adopt summer school classes to extend the school year or to sponsor after-school tutoring. They lengthened the school day by a little bit, and they relaxed time requirements in untested subjects. They increased collaborative planning and class prep time. They relatively reduced class sizes. But I should mention that just me saying what they did is not causal. We have to actually do the regression discontinuity type model again to try to get causal estimates. So what did we do? Here we did regression discontinuity and a seemingly unrelated regression framework, and we found that schools that received an F grade were more likely to focus on low-performing students, lengthen instructional time, reorganize the school day and learning environment, increase teacher resources, and decrease principal control. While it wasn't statistically significant, we also found some additional evidence of relative narrowing of the curriculum, of differential treatment of low-performing students, and at the potential expense of gifted students. So this is kind of the general sense as to what they were doing. However, I want to be clear that there could be a lot more school responses than we're picking up here, because schools are working from a menu of items, and some of these F schools had already been doing some of these things and got rid of it because it wasn't working. The key is, the most important takeaway message, I think, from this part of the paper is to say these schools were actively engaged in trying to change policies and practices affecting kids' instruction in the school. And one real question is, well, was that seeming like it worked? So that's step 3. Do policies appear to explain test score changes? So what we're interested in doing here is trying to gain insight into the mechanics behind these achievement gains, rather than identifying causal estimates of effectiveness of individual practices and policies. I'm not going to say what's the effect of looping on student test scores, but I am going to say schools that were doing all these different types of things we picked up on our survey, how much of the change in test scores, the gain in test scores associated with getting a grade of F, can be explained by the types of policies and practices we picked up in our survey. So we're going to estimate our test score models again, controlling for policy and practice domains. And I'm going to present the results for 7th graders, but if we looked at early grades, it looks the same. Million regressions again. We're going to restrict our analysis to F versus D, but if we look at F versus all comparisons, we get very similar results, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so how much of the test score effects are explained by the policy variables in our setup? So, okay, this is one of these half-empty, half-full stories. Depending on the model, if we're looking at the criterion reference test versus the norm reference test, we have anywhere from 15% to half of the test score gains associated with getting a grade of F explained by these variables. Now you may say, oh, 15%? Well, what gives there? But the answer, of course, is this was just what the 4 of us in a technical advisory panel kind of thought of brainstorming. But to the extent to which if there's any measurement error that's introduced in these school responses to surveys, if there are important responses that we didn't think to ask, all of those things are going to lead us to not explain as much of the test score changes. So if you look at this, the fact that we're explaining a significant, substantial portion, statistically significant, as well as economically meaningful fraction of this, says that these schools were meaningfully changing their behaviors, and those meaningful changes in behaviors are explaining non-trivial to substantial fractions of the gains in test scores we saw, which is, I think, a very successful finding. We break it down into p-values of money variables versus p-values of efficiency variables. What do we see? The things that require additional resources seem to be the things that were really working for reading. For the math gains, it looks like it's both the things that were intended to improve efficiency as well as those requiring resources. But again, I don't want to take this to the bank, right? The most important number to take to the bank is that these are much bigger than 0. If we were to look at a set of policies that we found that were significantly correlated with test scores, a lot of these policies have 0 correlation with test scores. So it's all well and good that some of these schools change some of these policies, but we find that they have no relationship with test scores. Again, it's not causal, just correlation. But if we look at the 7 policy domains that were significantly correlated with test scores, we find again anywhere from 15 to 2/3 of the distribution of the variation explained by the school responses that we picked up. So the upshot here is that changes in policies and practices that we have identified on our survey explain a reasonable to a large portion of measured test score gains in these F schools. And I think that's big news. So in summary, we estimate effect sizes of reading test scores among F-graded schools that range from between 0.06 to 0.1 of a standard deviation. For math, a little bit bigger. We find that F-graded schools do a lot of different things in the policies, and these changes in policies and practices explain a non-trivial fraction of the test score gains. So what does this mean then? Well, before you go and say this necessarily was a really great policy, of course, I'm an economist. We all know Harry Truman's aphorism about how he wants only one-armed economic advisors, so they can't say on the other hand. Here's the other hand. F-graded schools did receive additional state-mandated assistance. That said, we have a very difficult time believing that the additional, on average, $20 per student really generated those massive changes. especially since D-graded schools receive many of the same resource advantages as well. While our results suggest that schools respond to accountability in potentially very strongly educationally meaningful ways, we don't observe student performance along all dimensions. So this is why research like what Jay and colleagues are doing, looking at science test scores, for example, is so important. We're not looking at the low-stakes subjects here. It's really important to try to understand what's happening in low-stakes subjects as well as what's happening in the kind of the farther out areas and also what's going on in the overall distribution. Again, I wrote my dissertation, although this took a lot more time. But these are a couple of the things to take away. So, bottom line, I think, is that the people who put the A+ plan into action should feel pretty good. It looks like at least at the hardest to educate students, or at least the toughest to improve schools, we're seeing pretty large effects. I'm not willing to say how much of those large effects are due to vouchers, but it's obvious that a fraction of it must be in large measure because of the repeat F thing going on there. But we know that between this cocktail of vouchers and accountability pressure, that led to substantial and meaningful changes. So I went past my my thing, but questions are great. Thanks.
Well, my cynical and edgy question goes something like this. Having been a teacher for a lot of years, it seems to me that you could account for a huge amount of variance in student performance by looking at teacher quality. And my question is, has any teacher ever lost his or her job because he or she couldn't teach? I mean, I don't care what policy implementation you have in mind, if one of those policies is not to evaluate the ability of the teacher and take corrective action, no matter how draconian, I don't see how we can improve schools.
Sure.
So do something with that.
Well, actually, we're doing a little bit of that right now. So, motivated by these findings, Tim Sass at Florida State, a former graduate student of his at SUNY Fredonia, Li Feng, and I are now looking at the effects of the accountability system on the teacher labor market in Florida. And so we know that schools can't fire cruddy teachers unless they're in their first or second year. However, we do know that principals can kind of counsel out teachers. And we looked at so far we've been looking at what's happening to teachers. Now what we found is in the F schools we saw, in terms of value added, test score value added, we can take that with a grain of salt or interpret that however you wish. But we found that the lowest value-added teachers in the F schools were tending to jump ship. Now, unfortunately, also, so were the highest value-added teachers. Now more of the lower value-added teachers were leaving than the higher value-added teachers, but in part that's because there weren't all that many high value-added teachers in the SF schools to begin with. Now, what does that mean? What that actually means, to the extent to which the high value-added teachers were leaving, this means that possibly if we could figure out a way to only identify and counsel out the low value-added teachers and incentivize the high value-added teachers to stay, then maybe these 0.1 of a standard deviation might be a lot higher. Because I'm with you. How do we measure high value-added teachers? These were teachers whose average value-added was more than one full standard deviation above the mean. So that's huge in comparison to these numbers. If we can keep the high value-added teachers in the low-performing schools, combine that with these substantive policy changes and practice changes, then things could go even better. By the way, one thing we do know is teacher turnover also depresses student test score gains. So the fact that these F schools were attaining large test score gains despite the fact that they were losing a good number of their best teachers, and despite the fact that there was a lot of churning amongst the staff there, more churning than there would have been absent that, because of course these were in high poverty schools as well, where there's a lot of churning typically. If we can manage to cut teacher turnover and hold the best teachers in the school, I advocate huge bonuses. I mean, in my own home county, I actually have been asked by the superintendent and the school board to suggest some policies, and I've suggested $20,000 bonuses to keep high value added teachers in the schools. If these teachers were getting $20,000, I would advocate having fewer of these resources being given, and instead put the resources into keeping the best teachers in these low-performing schools.
Okay, that was the right answer.
So you're going to take me to Oklahoma? Yeah.
So how has that your advocacy for $20,000 bonuses been received?
Yeah, I can imagine.
Actually,
We'll send you to Little Rock instead of Oklahoma.
don't threaten me. Actually, in certain quarters it's been received very well. So I've talked so far to people in 3 different school districts in Florida, and actually in one of these school districts, and I can't name the school district yet, although I can tell you privately, but I won't say that on tape. In one school district, the head of the teachers union is actually on board with this, so I think it might happen. And it's in a large school district in Florida. So, what's that?
They're all large.
It's one of the largest school districts on the coast opposite to the coast that Jay used to live.
Okay.
So perhaps you can figure that one
I
out.
have it.
Okay, good. Yes.
So I'm trying, well, I actually have 2 questions. Here's one. I'm trying to imagine this test. Suppose I get an A because I get a 99 out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
And you get an F because you get a 40 out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
So for you to improve from a 40 to a 45 might be much easier
Mm-hmm.
than for me to improve from a 99 to a 99.1.
Sure.
So that's the first question. How do you deal with that when it comes to the data, given that a maximum is there,
Mhm.
and you already are new to the maximum, so you cannot go up.
Yeah.
And then the other question was, it seemed to me, if I understood well, that those who improved were those who got an F, or a negative shock to an F.
Mm-hmm.
But those are by far the minority of the schools.
Mhm.
Does it mean that everybody else showed no improvement?
Well, again, there are those are 2 excellent questions. So the first one is very easy to answer in the context of this paper, which is that if we're focusing on the bottom of the distribution of schools, we don't have any issues with ceiling effects because we're looking at average test scores that are typically well below proficiency levels, and very, very few students in these very low performing, very low socioeconomic status schools, very few students who are up against the ceiling effect. Now, my daughter attends Magnet Elementary School for gifted kids. Now, in that particular school, you do see a lot of issues with ceiling effects. So I think that in certain situations, we have to be very concerned about that, but not actually, I think, in the presence of this paper. Now, the second one, I think, is an extremely important question, which is to look at the systemic effects. It's actually very difficult. One reason why I and other researchers have tended to focus on one corner of the distribution of schools and compare that to the next nearest corner of the distribution is mainly because, unfortunately, what happened is we don't have a comparison state. The whole state of Florida was shaken up by this system. So you can kind of look at, so overall, average test scores on the Stanford test in the state of Florida have risen relative to the national average over the last 7-8 years. Overall, FCAT scores have gone up. Overall, NAEP scores have gone up a bit. So there are some benchmarks that say that there is something going on overall, but it's difficult to know. Maybe these improvements might have happened absent these policy changes. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important to kind of look at one corner or the other. So that's why the second companion paper I talked about was looking at, the companion paper looks at the A's at the top of the distribution. We find that B schools and marginal A schools seemed like they improved. Seemed like they improved considerably relative to schools that had the pressure taken off, what we call the safe A schools. But unfortunately, I mean, it's the real problem with evaluating any systemic policy is that we never can know for sure. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that the gains in test scores in Florida over the last 7-8 years would be unprecedented if it was just kind of random noise. However, from a scientific perspective, it's hard to know for sure. So, quietly, I would say, I think the strong evidence is that the whole state definitely improved, and it looks like the F schools improved dramatically more, and in the other paper, the schools that got safe A's improved dramatically less. But overall, it seemed to be an improvement, but just hard to know for sure. There's a question in the back then, Jay.
The scores in Florida, are they based on total students in the schools, or do they have to have all subgroups at a certain level?
No Child Left Behind. So you're talking about the school grades?
Yeah, the grades for the school.
The school grades are based on all students, and so there's no subgroup requirements. Now we can actually get into Now we can get into philosophical arguments about which one is best. I actually think that if the state of Florida puts I think about the state of Florida's new system starting in 2002 as really being in spirit what No Child Left Behind is trying to accomplish. And a large measure of the reason I think that is because if you think about it, the kids who are proficient get counted once. The kids who are marginally non-proficient get counted twice. The kids in the bottom quartile of the school get counted 3 times. Effectively in these grades. So in some regards, what happens then is that if you focus only on the proficient kids, then you're going to do very poorly. You have to focus on the kids who are less proficient, and those kids tend to be disproportionately from racial and ethnic minorities, and they tend to be more likely to be students with disabilities. So exactly the type of students who would have been called out on No Child Left Behind, but yet instead of them being specifically called out there, it's students who were struggling. So I actually think that's more humane, personally. Yeah, Jay.
There's a movement among reformers to simply identify what the effective practices for instruction are, and just mandate that people do them. Diane Ravitch and Edie Hirsch, they feel like they know what the right things are, and they want. It's by complete coincidence.
Let's go, Jay. Let's go.
You should know you're being recruited here.
So they want people to do the right thing, and in fact, actually over the years in doing research on vouchers, I remember giving presentations to groups of educators who would say, well, tell us what the private schools are doing, and we'll just do that. Just tell us what those effective practices are, and we could do it. Why? What? So, I guess then I have 2 questions. One is, what are the effective practices as best as you can tell? I know that you've referenced an appendix here, but can you at least guide us a little bit in identifying what practices might be the ones that work? And the second is, how would you feel about the idea of just, if we could figure out what they were, dispensing with all this pressure stuff and just telling people to do those things? Skip the middle step of the pressure and just have state policy mandate that you change your schedule or do whatever else is effective.
Well, so that's a tough question. I mean, my reaction to this, right, is show me a person who says that they've identified effective practice in education, and I'll show you a person who doesn't understand identification. So I mean, that's my first response. I mean, it's really easy. So it's not that easy, but it's a lot easier. This is an order of magnitude, or 2 orders of magnitude easier to identify, lowering the boom on schools and saying, hey, you know what? we're going to paint the scarlet letter on you. Plus, if you don't do better, then the kids are going to the kids can opt out of your school. I don't even feel comfortable saying how decomposing the voucher plus accountability effect into how much is voucher threat and how much is accountability, except that I think the suggestive evidence from the things I've talked about is that both of those seem to be pretty important in driving these results. So now take a step back and say, well, how are we going to, so I mean, we see some things that are highly correlated with student test score gains, but maybe what those things are is they're actually correlated with it principles. And so it's just a more with it principle is actually able to go and pinpoint, hey, this is what we really need to do. And so, you know what, if Diane Ravitch and E.D. Hirsch want to go invent a time machine and go 300 years into the future when people have been able to figure out exactly how to do this, and then take the time machine back here now and say, this is the path to everybody being proficient, then I'll be their deputy if they'll have me. But right now, I just don't know that, I don't think we're there. I mean, you know, I think that this is the first study that's even tried to do what we've tried to do, which is to just throw some stuff in there and see what rattles around. I'm not willing to say that looping is the solution or something like that, even though it turned out the schools that introduced that tended to do better. I'm not willing to say that, I mean, the one thing that turned out to be the most significantly correlated with test score gains was the breaking classes down into ability-specific subgroups. Well, now, I actually wrote a paper on tracking, advocating tracking a decade ago. Here, this is kind of informal tracking within it. It actually seems like maybe informally tracking within a classroom seems to work. But you know what? How do we know that? How do we know that it's not that the principal or individual group sets of teachers actually are just really better able to use information to identify who are the slow learners and who are the ones who need different assistance? And so, because of that, I mean, I just feel like if we go and we cut out experimentation right now. Without really knowing what the right thing is, we may ensconce a crappy system, and you know that's a technical term, but you know that's my fear. So yeah.
Kind of a boring question, but because I've seen it done so many different ways. What was your procedure to do that? Generate the percentage explained.
Oh well, the procedure is actually really easy. So we have.
Well, I've seen instances where it comes out to be over 100% and raises some eyebrows.
Yeah, well, you know, it turned out that we didn't get that. Actually, can one of these write on here, or is it writing on the small?
Word document.
Oh, that's really fancy. Okay. That's too tricky. I'm just going to describe it. Okay, so run the regression discontinuity regression, and so you estimate a coefficient for this is the effect of getting a grade of F. Now go and stick in all the test score variables on the right hand side and look at this is a grade of F estimate now, and then compare the two. So if it were 0.1 before and it moved to 0.05, then it's a 50% explanation. That's the procedure. So
If what was 0.1?
if the estimated tricky, if the estimated effect of getting a grade of F was 0.1 in the model that had the RD but didn't have the policy responses in the model, and then when you stick in all the policy responses and moves to 0.05, we estimate that as 50% of the F effect being explained by these policies. And now you see exactly why I think of these as probably gross understatements. The reason I think of them as gross understatements is that if we, in our infinite wisdom, ask the wrong question, or teacher or principals didn't understand our question, anytime we introduce measurement error, that's going to bias those coefficients towards 0, which means that's going to put things that maybe were F effects back, were policy response effects back onto the F. Yeah.
So I read in the New York Times not too long ago about a phenomenon that started taking place about the same time, like 2003, 2004, about reverse migration. And illegal immigrants having a harder time, and especially non-native speakers, English speakers having a harder time going back home, migrating to other states. Is it possible at all? Maybe the answer is no, and I think it is because of what you said about the control that we use. But is it possible that these migrational patterns, people maybe leave F schools, but they don't leave the others? Because if I'm an illegal immigrant from, I don't know, Asia, then I'm more likely to be in an F school. Is this possible? Experimental?
It's a good question. Let me think about the answer because I haven't been asked that question before. All right, so I think the answer to that is that it would have to be the case. So what we're looking at is at two cohorts, successive cohorts of children. It would have to be in order for that to be affecting this, it would have to be the case that more illegal immigrants left the F schools in the 5th grade cohort of 0203 than in the 5th grade cohort of 0102. And so I don't know the answer to that. But if that's the case, that could have contributed to this. Now, one thing which is important to note is I would argue that these illegal immigrant children are probably going to be relatively likely to be learning limited English proficient. Now, the one thing we know is that if you look at these two successive cohorts, the rate of measured limited English proficiency is identical in these F schools between these two. So it would have to be the case that it would have been illegal immigrants who were not limited English proficient who were doing it, or who had equal weights of limited English proficiency and not limited English proficiency. And so I can't rule that out, but I think that it would have to be really threading the needle in order for that to matter. But that's, Florida has a lot of immigrants and a lot of illegal immigrants as well. And so I mean I think it is a concern. So that's something we can try to investigate at least a little bit. Is there other questions somewhere?
Have we exhausted everyone? Bob has an announcement, so we should,
yes, we actually did not plan it this way, but in terms of announcing the next lecture in this series, which is 2 weeks from today, it actually is one of the superintendents in Florida who responded to the F schools in this program is General John Fryer, who is superintendent of DeVal County, and very celebrated superintendent with regard to the turnarounds that he did. So actually we can ask him what he did inside the black box to get the other side of this, to flesh out this story. And maybe this will be a good time for you to come back for your Oklahoma trip.
What are you doing in 2 weeks?
Actually, I'm going to be at BYU in 2 weeks. I've been to Utah before that.
Oh, yeah, wow. That's fun enough. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
It was a lot of fun.